Welcome to All About Money on HKIBC. I'm Chloe Feng. As the developed world looks to reduce its carbon footprint, it faces major challenges in responsibly sourcing large quantities of essential rare earths, which form the backbone of many critical industries. From aerospace to electric vehicles or mobile phones, minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper are indispensable. These are rarely found in large concentrated deposits on their own and many times need to be extracted from other elements instead. China does not have large deposits but dominates the processing part and thereby the supply of the commodity. The U.S. now wants to counter China's dominance in this sector and is building alliances with other Western nations to get easy access to this rich resource. So how will this lucrative and essential resource reshape the political and economic landscape in the 21st century? Offering more insight on the topic is Henry Sanderson, the author of Vote Rush, The Winners and the Losers in the Race to Go Green, which The Times endorsed as one of the best reads on science and environment in 2022. Henry grew up in Hong Kong and has previously worked as a reporter covering China and commodities for the Financial Times. He's now the executive editor for Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, a data provider and market intelligence publisher for electric vehicle supply chain and rare earth availability. So thank you very much for being on our show, Henry.
Thanks so much, Chloe, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And first, I want to have a brief introduction about your book. And can you just tell us what made you want to write this book and also focus on the energy transition businesses? And you also reviewed some of the dark sides of the industry.
Yes, thanks so much. So I wrote this book because in the middle of the COVID lockdown, our family got an electric vehicle. So I was interested in electric vehicles. But I've always been interested in clean energy. And as a reporter covering commodities and mining at Financial Times, I became aware of the huge amount of raw materials we need to rebuild our energy infrastructure, to transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy. It's really a mammoth task. We're talking to make a difference on CO2 emissions, to make a difference in terms of climate change. We need to replace millions and millions of vehicles with electric vehicles, and we need batteries to store solar and wind energy to better integrate them into electrical grids. So the scale of what we're trying to do is immense, and all of this requires raw materials, and this requires new mines, and it requires new supply chains. And I found this fascinating world behind, I guess, the face of clean technology that you see, such as the electric vehicle on your street. And really, the supply chains are full of interesting characters. They're full of geopolitics. And I guess most importantly is that China has quite a dominant position in a lot of these clean energy supply chains. And that now is becoming a real concern for the US and for Europe. So that's sort of what led me to the book. I was always interested in clean energy, and then I discovered this topic, and I thought it's sort of been an overlooked area of clean energy and the energy transition. So I wanted to bring it to people's attention to say, look, yes, we need clean energy, we need electric vehicles, but to do that, we need to build these supply chains, and this is what's going on, and this is some of the problems in them, so that if we can see these problems, we can improve them.
Right. I want to talk more about the China's dominance probably later on. But before that, can you also run us through the supply chain of electric vehicles, for example, from mining to the final stage of the finished products in the factories? And I noticed that the mining process can actually take as long as 25 years. So how come it can take such a long time?
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you think of our globalized era that we've had over the last few decades, the complexity we've built in supply chains, the efficiency is really amazing and incredible. And before you get to a battery, you're right, you have the material that's mined, but from the mine to the battery, it can travel thousands of miles around the world, and there's lots of different stages. So something like lithium might be mined in Australia, but it would travel to China to be processed, and then it could be turned into a battery that could be sent then to Europe or the US or elsewhere. So these are long, complicated supply chains. But on the mining side, this is really the problem at the moment, which, as you say, is that mines are really not easy. And if you visit mines, you see the huge scale of them, the size of the operation. They're really not easy things to build. They often take delayed, and they often take many years, as you said, as much as 25 years. So that's really the issue now, where you've got this demand for these minerals accelerating rapidly because of sales of electric vehicles, because of the need to combat climate change, the speed at which we need to accelerate this energy transition. But we can't build those mines quick enough. And in many countries, it's very, very difficult to build mines because of communities don't want them. Environmentalists and others raise concerns, rightfully. So we've got a key bottleneck at the mining side.
And for China, while it doesn't have enough raw materials, it does dominate, pretty much the whole processing part. Can you just tell us how did China manage to climb to its current position where it, dominates many stages in the supply chain, primarily in the processing part?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and I think it captures some of China's sort of rise in the world economy, which China started at the lower end, I guess, of these supply chains, and it took market share away from Japan in terms of making batteries for electronic devices. If you think of the origins of BYD or CATL,
Right.
which came out of this period where China, because of its low labor costs and I guess weaker environmental standards, it captured quite a lot of the sort of lower end of the supply chain. And things like processing these minerals, it's actually quite energy intense, and it's also can be quite environmentally damaging. You need lots of acid, lots of substances like that. So China, I guess, could be very cost competitive at that time because labor was cheap, the environmental regulations weren't so strict, and fundamentally China had cheap coal-fired power. But all of that's changing now, right? China has, its environmental regulations are much stricter. The cost of energy in China is going up. Labor costs in China have gone up. So all of that's changing now. And at the same time, the West also wants to build some of this industry itself. So we're entering an era where we need to decarbonize these supply chains, but at the same time, the West is looking to rebuild these supply chains from scratch, essentially.
Right. You mentioned about one of the Chinese companies, the CATL, Contemporary Parex Technology Limited. I mean, can you tell us more about this company? How did it climb to the top of the industry as well, becoming the world's largest electric vehicle battery maker? I mean, can we compare this company as the TSMC in the, for example, semiconductor industry?
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I think it is a giant in the electric vehicle industry, and it's a giant in the Chinese market. There's no other battery company that comes close at the moment, and I think it's a fascinating story. The reason they were so successful is they had this early experience, as I said, making lithium-ion batteries for consumer electronics in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was a company called ATL, which is where one of the founders of CATL started. So they had this really experience of cutthroat global supply chains in terms of pushing costs down, in terms of manufacturing lithium-ion batteries. And what CATL did, it span out of that earlier company, was really apply that expertise and technology to scaling up on a massive scale larger batteries for electric vehicles. And I think what they have done so impressively is produce batteries at a massive scale with high efficiency and high quality. They're profitable battery company, and it's really not easy. Making batteries is a really, really hard business to do at scale because you're making millions of these batteries all the time, and everyone needs to be perfect in quality, needs to be perfect in efficiency, because you don't want to put a battery in your electric vehicle that's going to explode, right? That can be very costly for automakers. So what CATL has done is very impressive because they scaled at the right time. Just as this EV demand was expanding, and they expanded the quality and the efficiency of the batteries. Now, of course, they were helped by the Chinese government in many ways. The Chinese government launched quite a protectionist policy in 2015, which effectively banned Korean and Japanese battery makers from the Chinese market. So they had that gift from the Chinese government. They were also really helped by BMW, a foreign automaker, who was one of their first clients. So it's not really, they did everything themselves. They got this help from foreign automaker and from Chinese government.
Interesting. And other than CATL, I mean, can you also run us through what are the other key players in the EV battery industry in China? For example, I know there are two stars companies in China at present. One is the Ganfeng Lithium, and the other one is the Tianqi Lithium. So can you tell us about these two companies? How important are these two companies in the supply chain as well?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I think now both of those companies are listed in Hong Kong, so I'm sure it's of interest to your viewers. These two companies, if you look at the lithium market, it's quite concentrated, and you have sort of what we call the big four lithium companies, and Tianqi and Ganfeng are part of this group, and they've really grown rapidly over the last decade to be amongst the world's largest producers, and they've done this by moving very quickly, by expanding very quickly and buying lithium assets outside of China, and also within China, becoming very good at processing the lithium into what we call battery grade quality. So as I said earlier, into a high quality that could be used in an electric vehicle that's not going to explode, right, or not going to be not work. So they've moved and expanded incredibly quickly. Tianqi Lithium acquired probably the best lithium deposit in the world, the Greenbushes mine in Australia, and it did so at a time before people were thinking about lithium and EVs. It was a very early and very strategic acquisition, and it's an amazing one, right? It's the best lithium deposit in the world, and Ganfeng as well has bought either stakes in or acquired assets in Argentina, Africa, and Australia. And it's also mastered, as I said, the processing at home. So these two companies have embedded themselves in the global electric vehicle supply chain. Ganfeng supplies Tesla, for instance. So it's a remarkable journey of success, because they started out very small companies and very local companies in China.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, Henry, for your insights. And let's take a short break for now. But coming up next, we'll have more discussions on the critical minerals in China and US and how it will reshape the rivalry between the two superpowers. So do stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of All About Money on HKIBC. I'm Chloe Feng. With us today is Henry Sanderson, the author of Vote Rush, the winners and losers in the race to go green, which the Times endorsed as one of the best reads on science and environment in 2022. Henry grew up in Hong Kong and has previously worked as a correspondent covering China and commodities for the Financial Times. He's now the executive editor for Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. So welcome to the program, Henry. Previously, we have talked about China's dominance in this clean energy or EV battery making sector, and now I want to know more about China and U.S. possible rivalry on this sector as well. Now that the U.S. has rolled out the semiconductor export controls, and it has sparked jitters for many Chinese enterprises and also the Chinese authorities. And some analysts are speculating that China could potentially retaliate by, for example, limiting its critical mineral processing supplies to the U.S. Do you think it could be possible?
I think it's possible, and they could, and it would be very difficult for electric vehicle producers. And we're already dealing with a lot of inflation, globally in Europe and the US. We're already dealing with delays in electric vehicle production. So I think it would be very damaging to the progress of clean energy in Europe and the US if China did that. But at the end of the day, it would just be a delay. It wouldn't, destroy our economies in the way that, holding back oil and gas does, which is much more of a threat. And I think, China's benefited hugely from globalization. And as I said earlier, their companies also want to come to Europe. They want to expand around the world. So I think for a lot of these Chinese companies, they want to be global suppliers and be known as being reliable global suppliers. And I think the risk for a CATL, the risk for someone like that is if they become enmeshed in in politics and in this geopolitical struggle, and if they are seen to be taking sides, because that will only accelerate the West's attempt to catch up to China. And we've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act that there's, right, when the US decides to do something, it does it, it could do it. And there's, a lot of money now in the US going towards this industry, and there's a lot of, political wills there, and there's a lot of talent in the US. So there's no doubt in my mind that the US can do it. And I think if China did something like that, it would just completely accelerate that momentum in the US.
Right, and still, I think we still cannot neglect the fact that this sector is also pretty much intercorrelated with each other, like it's also globally connected as well. There is a strong interdependence between each region as well. But speaking of the U.S., the new act, the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, do you think this act will also affect China's EV makers or EV battery makers at some levels? What kind of impact will it impose for the Chinese companies?
I think the Chinese companies are quite worried about it because they see that they risk being left out of these supply chains. If you think about the US supply chain, a lot of the companies building the batteries in the US, building the battery materials, are Korean companies, and those Korean companies for a long time really have relied on China and Chinese companies for the processing of battery materials, for the supply of many of these ingredients. So these companies now are very worried because they're thinking, wait a second, the US is saying no Chinese companies can be involved. So they really risk losing a lot of business because they supply these Korean companies that in turn are building these facilities in the US. So I think what these Chinese companies now are trying to do is work out a way where they can still be part of this supply chain supplying the US. And this might mean building facilities in South Korea, because South Korea is a free trade agreement country with the US. It's therefore eligible under the Inflation Reduction Act. So what we're seeing is, let's say Chinese companies involved in Indonesia, nickel in Indonesia, will send that material to South Korea to be processed there, which will then be eligible to go to the US and be eligible for the subsidies. But this is a threat for a lot of these Chinese companies. So they're thinking of ways around this legislation. As I said, I mean, this sort of fracturing of the global supply chain, I think is a threat for China and Chinese companies, and for them being part of the global electric vehicle revolution. And in the end, China and the US, we all have to think about how will this hinder progress towards solving climate change. We don't have a lot of time. We need to reduce emissions. We need to scale up these technologies that work. And I think that the more this geopolitical issue delays that, then I think is not in China's interest. They need global emissions to fall. It's not in the US interest either. So that's the risk with the current course that we're on.
And also on the China and Australian front, as Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese earlier said, Australia also hoped that China can ease some of the export restrictions to Australia. And the meeting between President Xi Jinping and Anthony Albanese during the G20 summit also seemed to suggest that the two countries could move the past years of disagreements and welcome a warmer time. Do you see that the critical minerals could be put on the table between China and Australia, perhaps during their later negotiations in this aspect, given that Australia is one of the top critical mineral suppliers in the world?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because we do see this slight thaw in China-Australia relations. I mean, really, when it comes to raw materials, Australia and China are interdependent. And it's sort of like a mutually assured destruction situation where Australia needs China and China needs Australia. I mean, most prominently in iron ore, right? China needs Australian iron ore, can't do without it. And Australia also needs that export market. But lithium actually is sort of a similar situation in that China needs Australian lithium. China imports almost all of Australia's lithium at the moment. And at the same time, for Australia, China is the big market. You know, China is still 50% of global EV sales. So until the Western markets really pick up, and until Australia or Europe or the US can build the processing capacity, Australia is going to be quite reliant on China. Now, of course, politically, Australia is seeking and looking to realign those trade routes to support the US in its build out of its supply chain, to support Europe. And politically, that's the way things are going. But it's going to take time, right? And at the moment, for the foreseeable future, there's not a market as big enough as China to replace that demand. So Australia, for the future, is going to be very reliant on China too. Of course, you know, it is a risk in a way for China, you know, to be so reliant on a country that is, you know, not its ally. It's very much a Western country. So I think China's looking to diversify as well in iron ore and in lithium, and they're looking at you know, projects in Africa, investing in Africa, investing in other countries around the world. But the issue is that those projects all around the world now are going to become much more competitive because the West has really woken up and is looking to acquire the same lithium deposits. So it's going to be difficult for China as well.
Right. We are running out of time, but before we wrap up, I do want to know your thoughts on this clean energy industry itself, because, you know, many climate advocates have long been troubled by the fact that obtaining the so-called green minerals essential for decarbonization, including lithium, cobalt, copper, and other minerals, require mining process that often destroy the ecosystems and harm the nearby communities. I mean, what is your view on the difficult balance between the new and old energy sectors? Because it seems that no matter how hard we try to reduce the environmental pollution, but then somehow we still pose some environmental concerns or even human rights or labor rights issues as raised in your book as well.
I think that's the fundamental issue, which is that as we move towards clean energy, there are a number of things that need to be sorted out and that we need to be aware of. At the end of the day, we'll rely on extracting these minerals for at least for a decade or perhaps 2 decades. And so we need to make sure that the extraction process is done in the best way possible with as least harm to communities and countries. And we need to bring those people into the discussion. And we need to bring the whole issue into the climate change discussion, because one of the critical issues about climate change is the rift between developing countries and developed countries. The developed countries have caused the problem. We've accounted for most of the pollution, and the developing countries will suffer. So we need to, as part of this discussion, bring these minerals into the discussion. You know, these developing countries in many cases are mining these minerals that we need to decarbonize and to sort out the problem the rich world has created. So this, I hope, will become part of the discussion. I think, though, we have to keep in mind that it's still much better than the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry is destroying the planet, perhaps, very, very, a huge risk to economies and countries. So it is much better. And once we've dug up these minerals, once we've built this infrastructure, we're finding now that electric vehicles last a long time, batteries last a long time. We can improve all these technologies so that they last, and then we can recycle them and get these minerals back. So it's just really this initial phase where we're building out this infrastructure where we need to sort out some of these issues. But we have an opportunity, as I say in my book, to do it better. This is a model that will still rely on extraction, but we need to make sure that it doesn't devolve into the habits of the past, the problems of the past, and try to sort it out. And I hope that my book sort of brings the discussion more into the open, because these supply chains and the minerals they need should be at the forefront of a lot of these climate change discussions.
Right. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Henry. Appreciate your time. That's Henry Sanderson, the author of Vote Rush, the winners and losers in the race to go green. And thank you for watching All About Money. We'll be back next Sunday night at 8:30 p.m. on HKIBC. Until the next time, see you then.
Thank you.